Okay. Okay, before we start, we want to dedicate this class to a refuah shlema for Robert Berman's daughter. If you remember, we were davening for Robert last week, Yaakov Shimshon ben Beryl. And now his daughter also needs a refuah shlema. Rachel Fruma bat Rivka. So we're going to dedicate our learning tonight. After the class, if Robert wants to say a few words, we'll gladly hear you. And at the end of the class, we'll remind everyone. Robert, you might want to put in the chat her name, Rachel Fruma bat Rivka, and then everyone will be able to see. Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We are continuing the book of 1 Kings, Melachim. We're in the middle of the 5th chapter, and we just learned about Shlomo's great wisdom and how that's where we ended, where kings sent their wise men from all over the world to learn from Shlomo Melech in Jerusalem. That was in the 14th verse. It says, "And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Shlomo from all kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." So this is before modern technology. And yet we're told that the wisdom of Shlomo, the word got out literally to the whole world, and people came from all over the world. Yerushalayim at that time was a world-class city, not just a world-class city, it was really like the spiritual center of the world, which it still is. But this was what we call the golden period. There was peace, and people came from literally all over the world. And the teachings of Torah spread to the whole world. Again, what people did with that, that's a different story. Maybe the true history of the world will be revealed someday. But Shlomo's wisdom, as we've heard, and we'll actually even touch on it today, is rooted in the Torah. When it says he had great wisdom, it's true. It says that he not only knew the wisdom of nature, but he spoke with nature to the trees and the animals, and he was on a very, very high spiritual level. But now we're going to kind of like change gears here. Sefer Melachim changes gears, and we're going to begin the whole story of Shlomo building the first temple. So that begins in the middle of chapter 5. So it begins by Shlomo sent a message to Hiram. Hiram was I don't know what his title was, but he was the king ruler of Lebanon at that time. And he sent him a message saying, and he explains, "You know how my father, that you had a very good relationship with, wanted to build a house to God, but he was not allowed to. But his son, me, was given the task of building the temple to God. And therefore, he asks Hiram that David and Hiram had a very good relationship. And in fact, it says in the 15th verse that Hiram had already sent messengers to Shlomo. He was among all of the kings in the world that sent people to hear the wisdom and then report back. And it mentions that Hiram always loved David. Now, we pointed this out in Shmuel Bet. There is no individual in the entire Tanakh where it mentions explicitly how many people loved him. It started at Shaul. And again, I'm talking about explicitly written in the text. It said that Shaul loved David very much. This is when he first came to him and he was playing music and calming his soul. And then he ended up marrying Michal, Shaul's daughter. And it says explicitly that Michal loved David. And Yonatan, Shaul's son, that David had a unique relationship with, it said that Yonatan loved David. And then later it said, and you don't find this anyplace else, all the people of Israel loved David. So here is this one more example of Hiram always loved David. And so now Shlomo's turning to him because, as he explains, it was considered there was no wood in the world as good as the wood of cedar trees of Lebanon. To this day, the symbol of Lebanon is the cedar tree. Just like, let's say, in California. California was once, I don't know the exact percentage, 70, 80% covered with redwood trees. It's down to about 3% now. That's what's left of the redwood trees. So the same thing in Lebanon. Of course, there are still many cedar trees in Lebanon, but it used to be the entire Lebanon was covered with these giant, beautiful trees. So Shlomo is sending a message back to Hiram saying, I'm going to build a temple and I want to make a deal with you. I want you to send the best of your cedar wood. And Hiram agrees and says he's very, very happy to help. But he also mentions, this is what you could send back to me. And so they made a deal. And in exchange for the cedars of Lebanon, it says that Shlomo sent Hiram 20,000 kor of wheat and 20 kor of beaten oil year by year. So they had a trade agreement, as simple as it is. But they had a very good relationship. And then it continues that Shlomo, just like David, had made what's called a covenant. He made a peace agreement between them. Shlomo also made a peace agreement with Hiram. And that is the first that we hear about. Shlomo is now ready to build the temple. And then chapter 5 continues that here it says God, again, this is not the first time, grants Shlomo with great wisdom. And there was peace between Hiram and Shlomo. And then it says that Shlomo raised a tax on the Jewish people in order to build the temple. And what was the tax? 30,000 men. In other words, as we're going to see, similar to today, where there's an army, and once you serve your, whatever it is, 2.5 or 3 years in the army, then you become part of the reserves. And we know for the last 2 years, a good amount of the soldiers who have been fighting the war were from the reserves. So here, Shlomo sets up a rotating reserve system where he gathered 30, this is the beginning of the taxes, 30,000 men and 10,000 a month would be sent to Lebanon, and 2 months they would be at home. In other words, this was a special national, not just tax, but a project that involved the entire people. And it began with 30,000 people. They would spend a month in Lebanon, helping to cut the trees and transport them. And of course, the bark had to be removed and they had to be cut to size. And they would spend a month in Lebanon and then they'd be home for 2 months. So it means that in a year, they would serve for 4 months. Sad to say, in the last 2 years, many of the reserves served well over 4 months a year in the army and mainly in Gaza. And then it says that Shlomo, now the tax system is increasing. There were 70,000 porters. In other words, people who would carry the wood and, as we'll see soon, the stone, and 80,000 stone cutters. In other words, this was a huge project here. This was not a small project. So we have 30,000 going to Lebanon, and we have in Israel 70,000 porters and 80,000 stone cutters, and 3,300 people who were the in Hebrew kablanim. They were the experts. They were in charge of all of these people. There were 3,300 people who were in charge of all these other people, to contractors. Thank you, Dara. Contractors, to make sure that the work was done. And then it says, very, very important date here, in the beginning of chapter 6, it says, and it was in the 480th year after Israel had come out of Mitzrayim, in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign, in the month of Ziv. Ziv is what we call Iyar, the 2nd month of the year. Why was it called Ziv? Ziv comes from the word shining, because in the month of Iyar, the sun really starts to bake. Nisan can be quite hot, but it's really usually mild. It's still a little bit of winter, spring, there's a little burst of summer. But by the time you get to Iyar already, the rains have stopped and the sun is shining all of the time. So in the Torah, Iyar is called Chodesh Ziv. So here again, in the 480th year from the time Israel left Mitzrayim, in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign, in the 2nd month, he began to build the temple. And one of the explanations is the importance of 480 years is because it was 480 years from the time we left Egypt till the time that Shlomo begins to build the temple. The first temple lasted 410 years, followed by 70 years of exile in Babylonia and Persia. But then we came back and rebuilt the second temple. So this 480 years is also for the time between the building of the first temple and the building of the second temple, which is just very interesting that that's how it worked out. Now, here, the book of Melachim gets into a lot of details about the building of the temple. And to be very honest, it is very difficult to understand in Hebrew and in English. And there are many, many, many details. I'm going to leave it to everyone who wants to delve into these details to do it on your own. It begins in the 6th chapter, and it really continues, and these are long chapters, through the entire 7th chapter until the 8th chapter. I'm going to pick out what I consider highlights, but we're not going to delve into all of the details of the measurements, and the descriptions, like I say, are very, very difficult to really understand how the temple is being built here. But the first series of measurements I will mention, because here it's talking about the sanctuary. Now, the Temple Mount is, I wouldn't call it huge, because you're talking about the Temple Mount for the entire Jewish people worldwide. In that in that sense, the Temple Mount was relatively small, and the temple was even smaller. As much as we talk about the temple, it was actually a very, very small building. It was the first temple was considered one of the most beautiful buildings of that time, and a lot went into it. But relatively speaking, it's actually a wonder that it wasn't built much bigger, because it served as a central focus of the Jewish people. So the first measurements that are given is that the length was 60 cubits, and its breadth was 20 cubits, and its height was 30 cubits. This is the actual sanctuary. And then outside was the courtyard. And then outside, it describes many, many, many different buildings and rooms. Now, we know that the Sanhedrin sat on the Temple Mount right next to the temple. And the way they learned this is, if we go back to Parshat Yitro, the end of Parshat Yitro, where the 10 Commandments are given, ends with a few mitzvot that many people question, like, why are they mentioned here after the climactic giving of the 10 commandments? But there it's talking about building the altar. And then the parsha ends. And we're not, like I said, it's a question why it's inserted there. But Rashi tells us that the next parsha is Parshat Mishpatim. Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. And these are the laws or the statutes that you will put before them. So Rashi, who is like an expert in explaining the juxtaposition of verses and portions next to each other. So he asks, why is this, what's the connection of the beginning of this portion of these are the judgments and statutes that you shall put before them with the end of the previous parsha that has to do with making an altar. So Rashi says, from this we learn the altar, of course, is hinting to the building of the temple for God. And the laws and the statutes, the highest authority was the Sanhedrin, what we call the Supreme Court. And so Rashi says, from the juxtaposition of the end of Parshat Yitro and the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, we learn that the Sanhedrin had to be established right next to the temple where the altar would be. So I'm explaining that because here it explains other buildings, and we know that as part of the temple, there were many, many, many different rooms where they stored the different vessels for the menorah, for the incense. In a certain way, the temple was like a slaughterhouse because of all of the animal offerings. So there had to be a place for the parts of the animals and all of the knives and instruments that are used for these things. And the wood had to be stored for the altar, and the clothes for the Kohanim. So this is why I'm not going into it in chapters 6 and 7, because it's explaining it wasn't just building a sanctuary like the Mishkan. The Mishkan was a relatively very small space. But here, there was a lot that went along with it. Okay, so continuing. So in verse 7, it makes a statement that is very, very well known. And it says, because remember, they had 80,000 stone cutters. Anyone who goes to the Kotel, we know that the Western Wall is not actually part of the temple. It was a retaining wall on which the Temple Mount sat. The Temple Mount was flat, but it sat on foundations. The Western Wall is a foundation for the Temple Mount. Now, and also if you've ever gone on what I call the tunnel tours, and we know that the part of the Kotel that we see is only a third of how tall it was. There was a valley there. That valley over the years was filled in. And so there are certain places where they have shafts that you could look down and you could see the Kotel, the other 2/3 of the Kotel, going all the ways down. It was a huge wall. Again, what we're seeing of it is about a third of it. So, so what it says in the 7th verse is that the house, meaning the temple, was built of stone, made ready before it was brought there, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the place where the temple was being built. It's a very, very well-known idea that they carved out the rock from the mountains. There's actually a place on the eastern part of the old city. It's called I don't know the exact name, but it's like the Tunnels of Solomon. And you can go in there and you can see some of the places where they cut the stone. But again, the entire building of the Temple Mount was pretty impressive. And you can imagine they needed 80,000 stone cutters to do this. And of course, 70,000 people to transport these huge stones. Now, when you see the stones of the Kotel, then you appreciate how large they were. If you go in the tunnel tours, you see a number of the stones that they say are equal to something like 70 tons each stone. I think it weighs more than a 747 airliner. Of course, and the question is, how did they lift these stones to the higher part of the wall? Obviously, they had a pretty advanced technology. It was all done by pulleys and apparatuses that they actually knew how to do. But here we see that there was no sound of a iron instrument hitting the stone while they were building the temple. But it was where they were. Now, there's a famous midrash that says, because here, when you read the text, it doesn't say that when they mined the stones, they didn't do it with iron instruments. But there is a midrash that says that even the cutting of the stone was not done with instruments. But when you read this, that's not the simple understanding. And that's what this is, the famous shamir worm comes in. That apparently there was a worm called the shamir. Actually, one of the prime ministers of Israel was Yitzchak Shamir. And this worm had the ability to eat its way through stone. And now how they trained these worms to cut the stone exactly, I have no answer for. I have no answer for. But here you see in the simple text that the assumption is that mining the rock and shaping it into the stones of the temple was done outside of the area, and then it was brought there and assembled. And then it goes on to explain that most of everything on the Temple Mount was made with the cedar wood. And the cedar wood then, depending on the building, would be covered by stone or surrounded by stone. And in the sanctuary itself, everything was covered with gold. You didn't see any wood or stone really inside the actual sanctuary. It was all covered with gold. And all of this is explained in chapters 6 and 7. Now, in chapter 6, verse 12, starts in 11, God comes back to Shlomo and says, concerning this house that you are building, you have to know, you have to continue to follow my commandments and walk in my ways as your father David did. And then I will dwell among the Jewish people. Meaning in this place that you're building, that's why we have the tradition that in the first temple, the presence of the Shekhinah was palpable. Only later, when the people started falling away from the Torah, then we're told that the divine presence left the temple. Now, and some of you who come to the Tuesday class will recognize this. This is exactly what we went over, is that Shlomo did an innovative thing here in the Holy of Holies. We know in the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaKodesh. And in the Aron HaKodesh were the 10 Commandments, the two luchot, the two tablets of the law. According to tradition, also the broken tablets. Other tradition that the jar of manna, the original bread from heaven, there was a jar of it, and the rod that blossomed into almond, like an almond blossom, to prove that Aaron was the legitimate Kohen Gadol after the rebellion of Korach, was also kept in the Holy of Holies. There's a whole discussion whether, and also the original Torah that Moshe wrote. But there's a lot of discussion among the sages. Was everything in the Aron, or was some of it next to the Aron? And that's a whole discussion in the Talmud. Now, on the covering of the Aron were the two kruvim. Now, this is something we discussed at great length in our Tuesday class on Maaseh Merkavah. We're not going to go back into it, but there were two angelic figures facing each other with their wings spread out on the cover of the ark. So these kruvim were not all that big. They were situated, and their symbolism was tremendous. But in actual size, they were not big. But what did Shlomo do? He did something completely different. He didn't eliminate the kruvim on the Aron. But what he did is he built two kruvim that stood on the floor. And it's described right here in chapter 6. And they were, I believe, 10 cubits high. They were very tall, and their wings stretched from one end of the Holy of Holies to the other. So this was a very innovative thing that Shlomo did, because that wasn't part of the Mishkan. And here later, we don't see that God objected. And as we learned, Shlomo was working with a blueprint that he had gotten from David. And in the text, it was through Shmuel HaNavi and Natan HaNavi. So there was prophecy here. And in the text, it was as if God had written the blueprint himself. So obviously, whether Shlomo innovated this or this was part of the plans that he received is not 100% clear. But this was a great innovation. These very large kruvim with their wings covering the entire Holy of Holies. And then, this is also something that we learned in Maaseh Merkavah. Then it describes the elaborate carvings that Shlomo did all over the temple. And he put kruvim everywhere. And he also put like pictures of or carvings of palm trees. And then we learn also of lions and oxen and eagles. And these are the exact figures of Maaseh Merkavah in the vision of Ezekiel. So that we discussed at great length in our last Tuesday class. And here's where it's described. Again, the 6th and the 7th chapter has all of these different details. And then it says, This is very important. At the end of chapter 6, it says, in the 4th year was the foundation of the temple established. And we learned that already. Remember, in the 480th year, in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign. So here it's just repeating that the building of the temple began in the 4th year of his reign. And now it says in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, which is this month now, Cheshvan, in the Tanakh is called Chodesh Bul, from Ma Bul, because this is when, according to the majority opinion, the rain started at the time of Noah. So here it says the house was finished with all of its parts according to all the fashion of it, which is hinting to that there was a plan. So here we see the building of the temple took 7.5 years. It began in the 4th year, ended in the 11th year, but it was between the 2nd and the 8th month. So it was 7.5 years, which is interesting because that's the exact amount of time that David ruled in Hebron. Even though at the end of the book of Shmuel, it says he reigned for 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. Originally, it says that he reigned for 7 years and 6 months, 7.5 months. And it's interesting that the temple here is built and started and finished in 7.5 years. But then the beginning of the 7th chapter, it says something very interesting. That Shlomo, while he was building the temple, he was also building his personal house. How long did it take him to build his personal house? 13 years. Almost double what it took to build the temple. And then it gives the dimensions of his house and how it was built, out of what materials. It was very similar with the cedar wood and the stones. It doesn't say here, though, that it was covered with gold. And then it says that Shlomo also built a house for the daughter of Pharaoh, who he had married. And if you remember, we discussed this already. It's not clear exactly when he married Pharaoh, because it's mentioned right at the beginning of when Shlomo began to reign, in just one sentence, that he married the daughter of Pharaoh. And then she disappears. And then we had what maybe or seemingly is a contradiction, because we have a midrash that he married her on the very day that the temple was inaugurated. So that was after 7.5 years. But here it says that he's building a house for the daughter of Pharaoh, also very elaborate. His house was huge. And it explains all of it in great detail. Then, in chapter 7, it says Shlomo sent for a person called Hiram in the city of Tsur. Now, this is Lebanon. Tsur is a city in Lebanon to this day. And his name is the same as the king of Lebanon. But it makes clear that he was Jewish. And it says that he was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali. And so why is he bringing him? Because apparently he was an expert in working with brass. Nechoshet. That's sometimes, it's the same word that we use in the Mishkan, that is sometimes is translated as copper. Here in the English translation I have, it says brass, But in relationship to the Mishkan, Nechoshet is copper. And then it goes to explain all of the work that Hiram did in the Temple Mount, all of the other buildings, and especially he made 2 pillars. And these pillars were set at the entrance of coming into the temple. And it even gives the names. They were given names. They were very tall pillars. And the right one was called Yachin, and the left one was called Boaz. And it was a very, very elaborate. It says that there were like lilies carved in the top. All over Israel, you have these pillars, and then they have a much wider top. There's a word for it, which escapes me right now. It's like a rim around it. And you see them all over Israel in archaeology from every period in the ancient world. And then it describes, and again, I'm not going to go into it in detail, a capital. Thank you, Toby. A capital around these pillars. But these pillars were very symbolic, because one was placed on the right and one was on the left, and they even had names. And there's a lot of significance to these two pillars. And then it describes what's called the Yam that Shlomo made. Again, in the Mishkan, when you would enter, the Kohanim, the Levim, or anyone entering had to wash their hands and their feet. And that's described in the Mishkan. But here, Shlomo made this like an ocean, a yam, a lake, a very elaborate. It was very large, and it was placed on 12 images of oxen. Again, this is very connected to Maaseh Merkavah, and we learned about this. And again, the details are very, very minute here about how he built this yam. But again, he made engravings of kruvim all over the yam and palm trees. But there's one part that's really connected, and we mentioned it with Maaseh Merkavah, that it says that under the borders, this is verse 32 of chapter 7, under the borders, all around this huge yam, there were 4 wheels, and the axles of the wheels were joined to the base. And the height of the wheel was 1.5 cubits. And the work of the wheels was like the work of a chariot, of a Merkavah. And that's why, excuse me. And that's why in the last class we did a Maaseh Merkavah, we saw that most of the images that Ezekiel sees in his vision, which is called Maaseh Merkavah, were already in the Mishkan and the temple. And that's why it's so significant that, and this shows what we try to, in a certain way, prove during the whole series, that Maaseh Merkavah, the vision of Ezekiel, is just one perspective of a much, much larger mystical tradition called Maaseh Merkavah. So here, in the 7th chapter, we see that part of the building the temple, there was a chariot. The wheels, remember the angels, the Ophanim, were called the wheel angels. There were all these wheels, and he's engraving kruvim, and they were built on oxen, which are one of the faces that Ezekiel first saw. And also, we learned from Rashi that in the Mishkan, there were also images of lions. And also here, it mentions here lions. Here, it doesn't mention eagles, but Rashi mentions eagles in the Mishkan. As I said, these are very, very long chapters. Now we get to what seems here like a little detail, but I'm going to expand on it. And that way we will finish tonight the 7th chapter. And then the 8th chapter is also very long. The 8th and the 8th chapter is very, very long. It's one of the longest speeches in the entire Tanakh. Sefer Melachim records Shlomo's prayer at the inauguration of the temple. And it's quite fascinating. I don't think there's any speech anywhere near the length of this recorded in the Tanakh. That we'll get to next week. This week, we're just going to finish finishing the physical temple. And like I said, I'm skipping over a lot of the details. But when you get to verse 49, it says like this, that Shlomo made all of the vessels that belonged to the Beit HaMikdash. He made the altar of gold and the table of gold. This is the table of the showbread, upon which the showbread was, and the candelabrums, the menorahs of pure gold. Now, this almost seems like just a little detail. 5 on the right side and 5 on the left side, before the inner sanctuary, with the flowers and the lamps and the gold and the bowls and everything connected to the menorah. So here we know from the Mishkan, one of the major elements of the Mishkan was the menorah of 7 branches that was lit every day. And of course, tremendous significance on every level. But if you noticed here, it says Shlomo made 10 menorahs, 5 on one side and 5 on the other. And so what I want to explain here is this is my drasha. Why 10 menorahs? There was only 1 in the Mishkan, but he put 10 menorahs. So why this is important, because it explains, we began to talk about it last week, and it's the very enigmatic idea that Shlomo married so many women. What was the purpose? What did he think he was doing? So here we'll see that if you have 10 menorahs, it means that you have 70 branches, because each menorah has 7 branches. So 7 times 10 is 70. So that's the key to understand here, because we learned that at that time, even today, we still talk about the 70 archetypal nations. And as we began to discuss, Shlomo, it was mentioned perhaps for political reasons, was marrying the daughters of kings all over the world. And perhaps that's how he kept the peace. It was a known thing until recently. Even today, the few kings and queens that are left, that usually, it's less now, but throughout history, they were all marrying other nobility. And in many times it was the son or the daughter of a king would marry the son or the daughter of another king as a political arrangement between countries. But that's not really why Shlomo was doing it. And it will only become clear when we read through his speech, because most of his speech is directed to the Jewish people. It's actually directed to God. Shlomo is saying a prayer to God. And it's mostly about the Jewish people, but there's a whole section there where he asks God, when people come from all over the world to pray in this place, that you and to acknowledge the reason that they're coming is because this is the temple to the one God, that you listen to their prayers and you accept their prayers. So what's happening here, and it's symbolized in these 10 menorahs, that Shlomo had a vision. It was a messianic vision. Remember, he's Shlomo ben David, Mashiach ben David, that Shlomo had a universal messianic vision. And he thought by, first of all, he had all of this wisdom, but nowhere does it say that he had to share it with the whole world. He could have said, no one's welcome here. Yerushalayim is for the Jewish people, everyone stay home. No, Shlomo not only accepted, but he taught the wise people from all over the world. Now, he had a purpose for this. This was to spread the teachings of the Torah. And the teachings of the Torah are based on the idea of one God, and that eventually the entire world would come to recognize him. Now, this goes back, his universal vision goes back to a previous universal vision, and that's Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu, he really had the first universal vision, and that's why he's called Avram HaIvri. HaIvri is the one who crossed over, La'avor. And we learned excuse me, that he was called that because he crossed over the Euphrates to come to Israel, but more important, he crossed a line of consciousness that no one else had crossed over. And it says that he stood on one side of the world and the whole rest of the world stood on the other. Why? Because at the time of Avram, the entire world were idol worshippers. He crossed over a line to the belief in one God. But not only that, he was teaching it to the whole world. And anyone and everyone was, in his eyes, ripe to be taught. And he wanted, not that he be on one side and everyone else on the other. He believed that everyone eventually would come over to his side. And we see throughout history, a good part of humanity has abandoned idol worship and has embraced the idea of one God or one creator or one divine energy, however we want to say it. And so this idea that if you look at the word Ivri is the root is ayin bet resh. And the root of Avram is Aleph Bet Resh. And then it becomes Avraham. But his Aleph is him standing on one side of the world. And the ayin of Ivri is the whole world standing on the other side. So now to bring this back to Shlomo, Shlomo puts 10 menorahs in the temple with 70 branches. And if you remember, this is very connected to the whole idea of the 70 oxen that are brought as sacrifices on Sukkot for the 70 nations. But then on Shmini Atzeret, only one is brought for the Jewish people. And that is, in a certain way, a symbolic manifestation of Avram's vision. But now Shlomo is actually trying to put it into reality. And so he marries all of these women. We'll still discuss the idea of their conversions, but his vision was he would bring the whole world to Jerusalem. He was building a temple. We, in our prayers, especially on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we call the future temple in God's name. God says, the house of my prayer for all peoples. But that was Shlomo's vision for the first temple. But obviously, in the end, we'll see he wasn't quite on the level. And unfortunately, the people were certainly, over the generations, fell to a very low level until the temple, almost by definition, had to be destroyed. It was a shell of its original purpose. But here we see in this little detail that Shlomo made 10 menorahs, we really get to the essence of what he was trying to accomplish. And so if we just put it all together, again, as we see, the kings from all over the world were coming or sending their wise people to learn from Shlomo in Yerushalayim. And where was Shlomo hanging out? At the temple. And so the whole world was experiencing the Holy Temple in Jerusalem with his wisdom. And by marrying all of these women, he was hoping to literally usher in the Messianic era. But again, we'll see as things develop that he is a human being like every other human being, and he had his failings like every other human being and his challenges. But here we're just trying to appreciate his vision, his ideal vision for what he wanted to accomplish and what he saw for the whole world. So may we be blessed to see the third temple, which will be God's house of prayer for all peoples. Bezrat Hashem in our days.